I thought Maine would be my escape, but it chained me to something older than I could have imagined. The fog tasted of salt and pine when I first rolled into Black Hollow, my pickup truck coughing like a dying man as it climbed the last hill on Route 17. 20 miles east of Millinocket, the road curved through thick stands of white pine that seemed to lean inward, their moss-slick branches forming a tunnel that swallowed the October afternoon light. The GPS on my phone had given up signal an hour back, leaving me to follow Clara Moreau's hand-drawn directions scrawled on a napkin. Not Clara, my ex-wife, but the tavern owner who'd answered my desperate call about the job posting I'd found on a construction worker forum. The Black Hollow Tavern sagged under the weight of those pines, its roof creaking like old bones even when the wind was still. What had once been a gas station in some forgotten decade now wore the tired skin of a roadhouse, its cracked timber walls painted a faded red that reminded me of dried blood in the dying light. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting sickly pink light across the gravel parking lot where frost was already forming in the shadows between the potholes. A rusted Texaco sign still clung to one corner of the building, its star barely visible through decades of weather and neglect. I'd fled Boston 3 weeks earlier, after Clara, my ex-wife, the one who still haunted my dreams, had threatened to take Sophie to Portland permanently. The divorce papers were still warm in my jacket pocket, along with the last photo I had of my daughter. 7 years old, gap-toothed smile, eyes that held more trust than I deserved. The construction job had ended badly, like most things in my life, when I'd missed too many days sitting in my truck outside Sophie's school, just watching her play at recess through the chain-link fence. The foreman had called it stalking. I called it being a father who couldn't let go. I'd driven north with nothing but a duffel bag full of work clothes and the desperate hope that distance might dull the guilt that gnawed at my chest like a parasite. The farther I got from Boston, the more the radio stations faded to static, until all I could hear was the whine of my truck's transmission and the voice in my head that kept asking why I wasn't good enough to keep my family together. Clara Moreau was waiting for me on the tavern's sagging porch, her frost-gray hair pulled back in a bun that hadn't moved since the Reagan administration. She had the kind of eyes that caught everything, the way I favored my left knee from an old fall on a job site, the stubble that said I'd been sleeping in my truck for the past week, the careful distance I kept from the edge of things, like I expected them to crumble under my touch. 60-something, built like weathered driftwood, wearing a flannel shirt that had seen more winters than I had birthdays. "You must be Eli," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. Her voice carried the flat vowels of northern Maine, each word measured and precise, like she was counting the cost of every syllable. "You look like him." "Like who?" "My son Lucas. He had that same lost look when he came back from his first tour." She turned toward the door, keys jangling against her hip. "He didn't make it through his second." "Afghanistan," she told me later, after we'd settled into the rhythm of employer and employee, 2007. An IED outside Kandahar that turned her boy into a flag and a folded letter from the Department of Defense. She'd been running the tavern alone since 1984, when her husband walked into the woods one November morning and never came back. The locals figured he'd gotten turned around, maybe fallen through ice on one of the beaver ponds that dotted the area like scars. Clara knew better, but she kept that knowledge to herself, the way people in small towns keep most of their secrets. The inside of the tavern felt like stepping into someone else's memory. Cracked vinyl booths lined the walls beneath a collection of license plates from every state and half the provinces: Manitoba, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, souvenirs left behind by travelers who'd stopped for coffee and never quite made it to wherever they were going. The jukebox in the corner wheezed out folk tunes and Acadian songs, its selection frozen sometime in the 70s when gas was cheap and the future seemed negotiable. Behind the counter, coffee burned in a pot that looked older than me, filling the air with the bitter smell of something too strong and too necessary. "Job's simple enough," Clara said, handing me a yellowed piece of paper covered in neat handwriting that looked like it belonged in a different century. "Cook, serve, clean, keep the place running when I'm not here. But there are rules." I glanced at the paper. The first line made me pause. "Always acknowledge the rider's headlight. Never hide." Rules? This ground's old, Eli. Algonquin hunting trails, colonial graves, places where things happened that left marks. She poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs, the liquid black as engine oil and twice as hot. You follow the rules exactly. No shortcuts. No thinking you know better. The writer died back in '87. Amos Reed, running from state troopers after a bar fight in Millinocket. Took the curves too fast, trying to make it to the Canadian border. They found his bike wrapped around a pine tree, but his body was never recovered. The coffee burned my throat, strong as tar and twice as necessary. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the neon sign buzz louder. The jukebox clicked and whirred, then started playing Joan Baez's Banks of the Ohio without anyone feeding it quarters. The song filled the empty space between us with its mournful melody, and Clara nodded like she'd been expecting it. Why are you telling me this? Clara's eyes found mine across the counter, and I saw something there that made my skin prickle. Because you remind me of Lucas, and because you'll see him soon enough. That first week passed quietly, like the calm before a storm that everyone can feel coming but nobody wants to name. I learned the rhythm of the place. Truckers stopping for coffee and pie before dawn, their rigs idling outside like sleeping giants. Border Patrol agents grabbing lunch on their way back from the Canadian checkpoints, their uniforms crisp and their eyes tired from watching an invisible line that meant everything and nothing. Locals who came in for the warmth and stayed for the gossip, their voices mixing with the creak of old wood and the whisper of wind through pine needles. The tavern's pine-soaked air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something that had been promised long ago. I slept in the small apartment above the kitchen, where the floorboards groaned with every step and the radiator clanged like chains dragging across metal. Some nights, I'd lie awake listening to the building settle, trying to convince myself that the sounds were just old wood and metal, not footsteps or voices or the scratch of something trying to get in. Clara taught me the prep work. The way she liked the coffee made, strong enough to wake the dead, she said with a straight face, and how to work the ancient cash register that rang like a church bell every time the drawer opened. She was patient but firm, correcting my mistakes with the same quiet authority she used to direct the fog that rolled in every evening like clockwork. The rules list stayed folded in my shirt pocket, yellowed paper soft as skin from handling, though I'd only glanced at it once or twice. The second week brought its own challenges. A Canadian trucker named Henri stopped by every Tuesday, always ordering the same thing, black coffee and apple pie, and always paying with exact change counted out in American quarters. He spoke in rapid French to Clara, who answered in the same language, their voices rising and falling like music. When I asked what they talked about, Clara just smiled and said, "Old times." By the third week, I'd almost convinced myself that Clara was just another eccentric Mainer, the kind who saw ghosts in every shadow and meaning in every coincidence. The isolation was getting to me. I'd called Sophie twice, but Clara's lawyers had made it clear that contact was limited to supervised visits, and those were a 12-hour drive away. Each time I heard my daughter's voice on the phone, she sounded more distant, already forgetting the man who used to read her bedtime stories and check under her bed for monsters. The tavern had its own monsters, though I didn't know it yet. The jukebox would sometimes play songs that weren't on its playlist, old ballads that made the hair on my arms stand up. The coffee pot would gurgle and hiss even when it wasn't plugged in. And sometimes, in the early morning hours when the fog was thickest, I'd catch glimpses of movement in the mirrors that didn't match anything in the room. Then, on a Thursday night that felt like the bottom of October, when the fog rolled in so thick it seemed solid, the rider came. I was wiping down tables in the empty dining room when the headlight appeared on Route 17, cutting through the fog like a blade. Too bright, too focused, moving with the steady purpose of something that had been traveling the same road for 36 years. No engine sound, just that light growing larger and brighter until it filled the tavern's front windows and cast everything inside in harsh electric white. Clara moved faster than I'd seen her move before, crossing to the door and flipping the porch light switch with the urgency of someone performing a ritual she'd memorized by heart. The bulb flickered once, then held steady, casting yellow light across the gravel lot like a beacon. She opened the door and stepped outside, standing firm on the porch with her arms at her sides, her back straight as a soldier's. "Come on," she said without looking back. I followed, feeling heat roll off that headlight like standing too close to a furnace. The light stopped maybe 20 feet from the porch, hovering at the height where a motorcycle's headlight would be, but there was nothing else. No bike, no rider, just that impossible brightness that made my eyes water and my skin prickle with something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't quite anything else either. "You don't hide from it," Clara said quietly, her voice carrying clearly, despite the fog that seemed to muffle every other sound. "You let it see you so it knows you're not one of the ones it's looking for. Then it passes by." Inside the tavern, a tourist family, father, mother, 2 kids who couldn't have been much older than Sophie, sat frozen at a corner booth, their phones dead in their hands, their vacation photos corrupted by whatever force the rider carried with him like a curse. Clara would comp their meal later, the way she always did when the supernatural intruded on the living. It was part of the rules, though I didn't understand that yet. The headlight lingered for maybe 30 seconds, long enough for me to feel examined, catalogued, and ultimately dismissed. I could feel it looking at me, through me, weighing something I didn't understand against some standard I couldn't imagine. The heat was intense, like standing in front of an open oven, and the air around us shimmered with waves of distortion. Then it moved on, following Route 17 east toward the coast, leaving behind only the smell of hot metal and burnt rubber and the faint echo of a motorcycle engine that had been silent for decades. Clara locked up early that night, pouring fresh coffee and settling across from me at the counter. The jukebox had gone quiet, and the only sound was the wind through the pines and the distant cry of a coyote that sounded almost human in the fog. "Follow the rules exactly," she said again, her hands wrapped around her mug like she was trying to pull warmth from it. "No shortcuts, no thinking you know better. The rider's just the beginning." I read through the list by the light of a desk lamp, 10 rules written in Clara's careful script, each one stranger than the last. Never serve anyone paying with silver coins. Respect all customers, living or dead. Help the living ward, off the dead. The paper felt warm in my hands, like it was alive, like it was choosing me as much as Clara had chosen me for this job I was beginning to understand wasn't really about cooking and cleaning at all. Outside, the coyote howled again, long and mournful, and I wondered if it was really a coyote at all. Maine was supposed to be my reset, I'd told myself. A place to start over, to forget Boston and the divorce and the way Sophie had looked at me the last time I'd picked her up from school. Confused and hurt, and already learning not to trust the man who was supposed to protect her from everything. But as I folded the rules back into my pocket and listened to Clara climb the stairs to her own apartment, I realized that some places don't let you forget. They just give you new things to remember. New ways to fail the people who depend on you. The fog pressed against the windows like something alive, and somewhere in the distance, I could swear I heard the faint rumble of a motorcycle engine that shouldn't exist. The 4th week at Black Hollow brought its own strange rhythms, like learning to dance to music only the dead could hear. I'd settled into the tavern's pulse by then. The way the coffee pot gurgled to life at 4:30 each morning, how the fog rolled in from the coast like clockwork at sunset, the particular creak the front door made when the wind changed direction. Clara had taught me to read the signs. When truckers ordered their coffee black, they were running behind schedule. When they asked for cream and sugar, they had time to kill and stories to tell. The Border Patrol agents always sat in the same booth, backs to the wall, eyes on the door. They never ordered dessert. The pine-soaked air felt heavier those days, weighted with something I couldn't name, but was learning to recognize. Maine, in late October, carried the scent of dying leaves and coming snow, but underneath it all was something else, something that made the hair on my arm stand up when I wiped down tables after midnight. Clara called it the weight of old ground, but I was beginning to think it was the weight of old secrets. I'd memorized the rules by then, though I hadn't needed to use most of them. The yellowed paper lived in my shirt pocket, soft as tissue from handling, and sometimes I'd catch myself touching it like a talisman. Always acknowledge the rider's headlight. Never hide. That was rule number 1, and I'd learned it the hard way 3 weeks earlier. The other 9 were still mysteries, warnings for situations I couldn't imagine but was beginning to dread. The regulars had started to accept me. Henri, the Canadian trucker, still spoke rapid French to Clara every Tuesday, but now he nodded to me when he ordered his black coffee and apple pie. Sam Whitaker, the rancher who lived 10 miles up Route 17, had begun including me in his weather predictions. Storm coming Thursday, you mark my words. As if my acknowledgement made them more likely to come true. Even the border agents had started calling me by name instead of just, "Hey kid." But it was the strangers who made my skin crawl. They came through in ones and twos, usually after dark, usually when the fog was thick enough to hide secrets. They ordered simple things, coffee, pie, sometimes a sandwich, and they paid in cash that felt too old, too worn, like it had been passed through too many hands in too many decades. Clara watched them carefully, her frost-gray eyes tracking their movements with the patience of someone who'd learned to recognize predators. "Dead folks travel different roads," she told me one evening as we closed up. "But sometimes those roads cross ours." I thought she was speaking metaphorically until the fourth Thursday, when the woman in the tailored coat came in. It was 10:30 p.m., and the last of the dinner crowd had cleared out an hour earlier. I was restocking the coffee station when the door chimed, and she walked in like she owned the place, mid-40s, wearing a charcoal wool coat that looked expensive enough to feed a family for a month. Her hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and her makeup was flawless in a way that suggested either money or vanity, or both. She took a corner booth without waiting to be seated, sliding across the cracked vinyl with practiced ease. When I approached with a menu, she waved it away. "Coffee and a slice of apple pie," she said. Her voice carried the flat accent of somewhere else. Not Maine, not Boston, but something in between. "Make sure the coffee's hot." I poured her coffee from the fresh pot, steam rising from the cup like incense. The pie was Clara's recipe, made that morning with apples from a farm in Orono. The woman ate methodically, cutting precise bites and chewing with the focus of someone performing a ritual rather than enjoying a meal. She didn't speak again until she was finished, pushing the empty plate away and reaching into her purse. That's when I saw the coins, 3 of them, tarnished silver that caught the diner's fluorescent lights and threw them back wrong. They looked old, not antique old, but old in a way that made my teeth ache just looking at them. Each one was roughly the size of a silver dollar, but the markings were strange, like they'd been minted somewhere that didn't follow American standards. "This should cover it," she said, placing the coins on the table with the careful precision of someone setting chess pieces. I picked them up without thinking. Rule number 2 might as well have been written in invisible ink for all the good it did me in that moment. The coins felt warm, too warm, like they'd been sitting in someone's pocket on a summer day. My fingertips tingled where they touched the metal, and for a second I could swear I heard something like children's laughter, distant and hollow. "Thank you," I said, pocketing the coins. "Have a good evening." She smiled then, and it was the kind of smile that made me want to check the locks twice before going to bed. "Oh, I will," she said. "I always do." I turned to clear another table, and when I looked back, she was gone. Not gone like she'd left while I wasn't paying attention, gone like she'd never been there at all. The booth was empty, the coffee cup was clean, and the pie plate had vanished. Even the lingering scent of her perfume, something floral and expensive, had faded to nothing. I stood there for a full minute, staring at the empty booth and feeling the warm weight of the silver coins in my pocket. My hands were shaking slightly, and I couldn't tell if it was from fear or from the strange tingling that was spreading up my arms. "Problem, Eli." Clara's voice came from behind the counter, steady as always. "The woman," I said. "In the coat. She just disappeared." Clara glanced at the booth, then back at me. "She's not trouble," she said calmly. "Just passing through." "But did she pay?" I pulled the coins from my pocket, holding them out like evidence. Clara's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. Not surprise, but recognition. "Silver coins," she said, coming around the counter. "How many?" "3. She nodded, as if that confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Rule number 2, Eli. We never serve anyone paying with silver coins." I felt the blood drain from my face. I didn't know. She seemed normal, and It's done now. Clara took the coins from my palm, and I noticed she was careful not to let them touch her skin directly. No harm in it this time. She was just testing. Testing what? Whether you knew the rules. Clara walked to the register and pulled out a small wooden box from underneath. Inside were maybe 24 more silver coins, all tarnished black as midnight. Dead folks don't need change, but they like to see if you'll try to give it to them anyway. The tingling in my fingers was getting worse, spreading up my arms like frost. What happens if I had tried to make change? Depends on who they are and what they want. Clara closed the box and put it back under the register. Some just want to remind you they're still around. Others, she shrugged, others want to take something back with them. I spent the rest of that shift jumping at shadows, but nothing else strange happened. The woman didn't come back, and gradually the tingling in my hands faded to nothing. By closing time, I'd almost convinced myself it was just another eccentric local with old coins and a talent for slipping out unnoticed. Almost. 2 days later, Lena Dubois came by with news that made my skin crawl all over again. I'd heard about Lena from the regulars. She ran a general store in Millinocket and had lived in the area her whole life. 50-something, built like a fire hydrant, with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. When she walked into the tavern that Saturday afternoon, she looked like she'd seen a ghost. "Clara," she said without preamble, settling onto a stool at the counter. "We need to talk." Clara poured coffee without being asked, the way she did for all the old-timers. "What's got you spooked, Lena?" "Found tracks down by the Penobscot River this morning. Human footprints, size 8 or 9 women's shoes." Lena wrapped her hands around her mug like she was trying to pull warmth from it. "Problem is, they start at the water's edge and head toward the road. Then they just stop." "How far from the road?" "Maybe 20 yards. Middle of nowhere, nothing around but trees and mud." Lena took a sip of coffee and grimaced. "Tracks just end, like whoever was making them just vanished into thin air." I felt that familiar prickle of unease. Could have been a hiker who turned around? Lena looked at me like I'd suggested the tracks belonged to Bigfoot. "Son, I've been tracking deer and moose in these woods since before you were born. Those prints were heading in one direction only, and they didn't turn around. They just stopped." Clara refilled Lena's cup, her movements careful and deliberate. "Anything else strange?" "Mrs. Cormier's dog won't stop howling at night. Eddie Thibodeau found his chickens arranged in a perfect circle in his coop, all facing inward like they were having a meeting." Lena's voice dropped. "And my nephew swears he saw lights under the water near the old logging bridge." "What kind of lights?" "The kind that move like they're following something." Clara was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee like it might hold answers. Finally, she looked up at me. "Eli, fetch the herb bundles from the back room, the ones in the mason jars." I found them on a shelf in the storage room, maybe a dozen small cloth bundles tied with twine, each one smelling of sage and something else I couldn't identify. When I brought them back, Clara was explaining something to Lena in a voice too low for me to catch. "Take these," Clara said, handing Lena half the bundles. "Pass them out to folks who need them. Tell them to hang one over their door and keep one in their truck." "What about the silver coin situation?" Lena asked. Clara glanced at me, then back to Lena. "Rule number 2 got tested the other night. No harm done, but word's getting around." "They're stirring up again?" "Seems like it." Clara pulled out the wooden box and showed Lena the collection of blackened coins. "Never give change for silver coins, Lena. Dead folks don't need it, and they don't like being reminded they can't use it anyway." Lena studied the coins with the expression of someone examining evidence at a crime scene. "How many years has it been since they came through regular-like?" "Not since the harvest moon in '98, Clara said. "But that was different. That was the collector's year." The way she said it, like collector, was a proper noun, a title rather than just a word, made my stomach clench. I wanted to ask what she meant, but something in Clara's expression warned me off. Lena left with the herb bundles and a promise to spread the word quietly through town. That evening, our first customer was Ben Thibodeau, a trucker who ran the Millinocket to Calais route twice a week. I'd served him maybe a dozen times, and he was usually good for a joke and a complaint about the weather. Tonight, he looked like he'd seen his own death. "Coffee," he said, sliding onto his usual stool. "Make it strong." I poured him a cup of Clara's industrial-strength brew, and he drained half of it in one gulp. His hands were shaking slightly, and there were dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. "Rough run?" I asked. Ben laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Heard my mother's voice on the radio tonight." Clara appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish rag. She took one look at Ben's face and nodded like she'd been expecting this. "What did she say?" Clara asked. "Same thing she used to say when I was late getting home from school. Benjamin Thibodeau, you get yourself home right now. Your supper's getting cold." Ben's voice cracked slightly. "Thing is, my mother's been dead for 15 years. Clara disappeared into the back room and returned with one of the herb bundles. "Keep this in your truck," she said, pressing it into Ben's palm. "And if you hear her voice again, you don't answer. You don't even acknowledge it. You just keep driving." "What if—" "No what ifs, Ben. Dead voices on the radio are like dead folks with silver coins. They're not looking for conversation." Clara refilled his coffee cup. "You just keep driving and let the living worry about the living." Ben nodded and pocketed the bundle. He finished his coffee in silence, left a $5 tip, and drove off into the night with his taillights disappearing into the fog like red eyes closing. That's when the jukebox started playing La Llorona. I'd heard the song before, a haunting Mexican ballad about a weeping woman who drowned her children and was doomed to wander the earth searching for them. But hearing it in the empty tavern, with fog pressing against the windows and the memory of Ben's frightened face still fresh in my mind, made it sound less like music and more like a warning. Clara froze in the middle of wiping down the counter, her dish rag suspended in midair. She listened to the entire song without moving, her face growing paler with each verse. "How many times has it played that song this week?" she asked when the music stopped. I thought back, trying to remember. "Once before, I think. Maybe Tuesday night?" Clara nodded grimly. "If La Llorona plays 3 times in 1 week, we close the kitchen early, lock up, cover the mirrors, and wait for sunrise." "Why?" "Because when she starts crying, other things start listening." As if summoned by her words, the jukebox clicked and whirred, the mechanical sounds unnaturally loud in the silence. I watched the selection wheel spin, hoping it would land on something harmless, Johnny Cash maybe, or one of the Acadian folk songs that usually played. Instead, the opening notes of La Llorona filled the air again. Clara reached for the phone behind the register. "I'm calling Lena," she said. "Tell her to spread the word. Nobody walks alone after dark until this passes." I stared at the jukebox, watching the colored lights dance across its chrome facade. The song seemed louder this time, more insistent, and I could swear I heard something underneath the melody, a sound like sobbing, distant and hollow and utterly heartbroken. "Clara," I said, "what happens if it plays a 3rd time?" She was already dialing, but she paused to look at me. In her eyes, I saw the weight of all the secrets she'd been carrying, all the rules she'd learned the hard way over 40 years of running a tavern on ground that remembered things the living had forgotten. "Then we find out if you're really ready for this job," she said. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like something alive, and somewhere in the distance, I could swear I heard the sound of a woman weeping. The 6th week brought omens written in frost and shadow, and I was finally learning to read them. The morning after La Llorona played twice, I found Clara in the restroom, staring at the mirror above the cracked porcelain sink. She stood perfectly still, her frost-gray hair catching the yellow light from the bare bulb overhead, but her reflection moved independently, turning its head, raising one hand, pointing toward the door behind me. "Rule number 5, she said without turning around. "Never trust mirrors after midnight." I stepped closer, my boots echoing on the pine-soaked floorboards. In the mirror, I could see myself standing beside Clara, But there was something else, a shadow that belonged to neither of us, tall and angular, wearing what looked like a long coat from another century. The shadow moved like smoke, shifting and wavering, but its presence felt solid as stone. "What is that?" Samuel Black. Trader who came through in 1894, winter that killed half the settlement. Clara's voice carried the weight of old knowledge, stories passed down through generations of tavern keepers. Found him frozen to death 3 miles up Route 17, but his horse made it back to town with empty saddlebags. Nobody ever figured out what he was carrying. The shadow in the mirror pointed again, more insistently, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Maine October air. What's he trying to tell us? Same thing he's been trying to tell us for 130 years. Something big is coming, and we need to be ready. Clara turned away from the mirror, but I caught her glance back one more time, checking to make sure the shadow was gone. Samuel only shows up when the harvest moon's getting close. That afternoon, Sam Whitaker came by with news that made my skin crawl like ants were marching under it. Sam was a rancher who ran cattle on land that had been in his family since before the Civil War, a weathered man in his 60s who spoke in careful, measured sentences. He usually stopped by on Saturdays for coffee and Clara's famous apple pie, but today, he sat hunched over his mug like he was trying to hide from something. "Found something strange in the south pasture," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee with hands that shook slightly. 7 holes, each one about the size of a coffee can, running in a straight line from my property toward Route 17. Clara's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. "How deep?" "Deep enough that I couldn't see the bottom with a flashlight. Dropped a stone in the first one. Never heard it hit." Sam's eyes found mine, and I saw fear there. The kind of fear that comes from living on the same land for generations and knowing when something isn't right. Dirt around them's black as charcoal and nothing growing within 10 feet of each hole. Clara stood and disappeared into the back room, returning with a mason jar full of what looked like coarse salt mixed with dried herbs. She handed it to Sam with the same careful precision she used for everything else. "Sprinkle this around your house," she said. "All 4 corners, every door and window. And Sam, don't let your cattle near those holes after dark." "What are they?" 7 holes in a line mean the harvest moon brings hunger." Clara's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Something's been sleeping under the ground around here, and it's starting to wake up." That night, after we'd locked up and counted the till, Clara showed me what she meant. She led me to the basement, a space I'd glimpsed but never really explored, down wooden stairs that creaked like old bones with every step. The air smelled of damp stone and something else, something organic and unpleasant, like flowers left too long in water. The basement was larger than I'd expected, carved out of native granite with walls that wept moisture even in dry weather. Mason jars lined wooden shelves, filled with herbs and roots I couldn't identify, and hanging from the ceiling were bundles of what looked like sage mixed with pine needles and something that smelled faintly of copper. "This is where we wait it out," Clara said, gesturing to cots arranged along one wall. "When the harvest moon rises, when the holes start to sing, we come down here and we stay until dawn." "Sing?" "You'll know it when you hear it. Sounds like children humming, but underneath there's something else. Something hungry." She pointed to a collection of photographs tacked to one wall, black and white images that looked like they'd been taken with an old Polaroid camera. "These show what really happens up there when we're down here." The photographs made my stomach turn. They showed the tavern's dining room, but wrong. The air itself seemed to writhe like living smoke, and there were shapes moving through it, tall and thin and reaching toward the camera with arms that stretched too far. In one photo, something that might have been a face pressed against the front window, but the features were all wrong, like they'd been smeared across the glass. What are those things? Hungry dead. They follow the paths between worlds, looking for the living to take back with them. Clara picked up one of the photographs, studying it like a medical examiner looking at evidence. "The holes Sam found? They're like doorways. Open them wide enough, and things start to crawl through. I thought about the shadow in the mirror, about Samuel Black pointing toward the door. Is that what killed your husband? Clara's face went very still. Thomas was a good man, but he was stubborn, thought he could handle whatever was out there in the woods. She put the photograph back on the wall. I found his clothes folded neat as you please on the kitchen table the next morning. Everything else was gone. The 7th week brought dreams that felt more real than waking. I'd started sleeping badly, waking up at 3 in the morning with the taste of copper in my mouth and the sound of children's laughter echoing in my ears. The dreams were always the same. I was walking through the pine forest behind the tavern, following a path that seemed to glow with its own light, and somewhere ahead of me I could hear Sophie calling my name. In the dreams, I would follow her voice deeper into the woods, past trees that grew too close together and streams that ran uphill, until I reached a clearing where 7 holes gaped in the earth like open mouths. Sophie would be standing at the edge of the largest hole, but when she turned to face me, her eyes were black as midnight, and she spoke in a voice that wasn't hers. "Come with me, Daddy. Come down where it's safe." I'd wake up reaching for her, my heart hammering like a construction worker's drill, and it would take me hours to convince myself that it was just a dream. But the taste of copper would linger, and sometimes I'd find pine needles in my hair, though I couldn't remember going outside. Lena came by on a Wednesday with news that made everything worse. "Half the town's having the same dream," she said, settling onto her usual stool at the counter. "Kids, mostly, hearing their parents calling from the woods. But it's not just kids. Mary Thibodeau swears she heard her grandmother singing down by the river, and her grandmother's been dead for 20 years. Clara poured coffee for both of us, her movements slow and deliberate. "How many?" "Maybe 24 so far. Could be more who aren't talking about it." Lena wrapped her hands around her mug like she was trying to pull warmth from it. "But here's the thing that's got me spooked. Every one of them dreams about the same clearing, and every one of them says there were 7 holes arranged in a circle." I felt my blood turn to ice water. "Like the ones in Sam's pasture?" "Bigger," Lena said, "deep enough to swallow a person whole." That night, the jukebox played La Llorona for the 3rd time. I was wiping down tables when the song started, that haunting Mexican ballad about a woman who drowned her children and was doomed to wander the earth searching for them. But this time, it sounded different, slower, more mournful, like a funeral dirge played underwater. Clara appeared from the kitchen so fast she might have been waiting for it. She stood in the doorway, dish rag in her hands, listening to every note with the intensity of someone decoding a message. "That's 3 times, she said when the song ended. "What does that mean?" "It means we close the kitchen early tonight. It means we cover all the mirrors and burn sage in every corner." She disappeared into the back room and returned with more of those herb bundles, tossing them to me one by one. "It means the harvest moon's close enough to start pulling at the barriers between worlds." We worked in silence, hanging herbs over doorways and windows, spreading salt across thresholds, covering every reflective surface with sheets and towels. The tavern felt different with the mirrors covered, smaller somehow, like we were hiding in a cave while something prowled outside. "The geology student from last week," Clara said as we finished up. "The one who didn't have a reflection?" I remembered him, young guy, maybe 25, studying rock formations along the Penobscot River. He'd ordered coffee and pie, paid with exact change, and when I'd glanced at the mirror behind the counter, I'd seen only empty space where he should have been standing. "What about him?" "They found his body this morning, frozen solid in his tent, even though it's been 60 degrees all week." Clara locked the front door and turned the sign to closed. "Coroner says he's been dead for days, but his phone shows he was posting on social media as recently as yesterday." The pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture I didn't want to see. The mirrors show what's coming or gone. Past, present, and future all get tangled up when the harvest moon rises. Dead folks start walking around like they're still alive, and living folks start disappearing into places that don't exist on any map. Clara pulled out a wooden box I'd never seen before, filled with what looked like old photographs. The tavern sits on what my grandmother called a crossroads, not just of highways, but of worlds. Most of the time, the barriers hold, but every few years, usually around the harvest moon, things start to bleed through. She showed me photographs that made my head spin, the tavern as it had been in different decades, but wrong in ways I couldn't quite identify. In some, the dining room was full of people dressed in clothes from the 1950s, but their faces were blurred like they were moving too fast for the camera. In others, the interior looked like it was underwater, with shapes swimming through the air where customers should have been sitting. "This is what the mirrors show after midnight," Clara said. "Not what is, but what might be, or what was, or what's trying to become." That night, I dreamed about Sophie again, but this time I was smart enough to stay in bed. In the dream, she stood at the foot of my cot in the basement, wearing a white dress that seemed to glow with its own light. She looked exactly as I remembered her, gap-toothed smile, pigtails, the small scar on her chin from when she'd fallen off her bike. "Why won't you come with me, Daddy?" she asked, and her voice was so perfectly hers that I almost reached out to touch her. But in the covered mirror across the room, I caught a glimpse of something else. Not Sophie, but something tall and thin and hungry, wearing her shape like an ill-fitting coat. The thing's real face was visible for just a second in the reflection, featureless and terrible, before the mirror went dark again. I woke up with tears on my cheeks and the absolute certainty that whatever was coming for us was getting stronger. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, but it sounded almost like a child crying, and I wondered if it was really a coyote at all. The harvest moon was still 2 weeks away, but I could already feel its pull, like a tide that hadn't started to turn yet but was gathering its strength somewhere deep beneath the surface. Clara was right. Something big was coming, and we needed to be ready. I just wasn't sure if ready would be enough. The 8th week arrived with the weight of inevitability, like watching a storm gather strength on a horizon you couldn't escape. The harvest moon rose blood orange through the pine canopy on the night that would change everything I thought I knew about sacrifice. I'd spent the morning helping Clara prepare the basement, carrying down mason jars filled with herbs whose names I couldn't pronounce, and setting up cots that smelled of mothballs and old fear. The stone walls wept moisture despite the October chill, and the air held the metallic taste of something ancient stirring beneath the ground. "Tonight's the night," Clara said, checking her watch as the last customer, Henry, the Canadian trucker, finished his coffee and pie. It was only 7:30, but she'd already started closing procedures, wiping down tables with the methodical precision of someone preparing for battle. "Sam and Lena should be here within the hour." I folded the last of the towels we'd used to cover the mirrors, my hands still tingling from where I'd touched the glass. The reflections had been wrong all day, showing shadows that moved independently, faces that belonged to no one in the room. And once, just once, my own reflection had turned to look directly at me before I jerked my hand away from the surface. "What exactly happens during the harvest moon?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. Clara paused in her cleaning, staring out the front window where fog was already beginning to gather between the pine trunks like smoke from some massive, invisible fire. "The barriers get thin. Things that usually stay on their side of the world start pushing through to ours." She gestured toward the basement door. "That's why we go below. Stone walls, iron nails in the support beams, herbs that have been blessed by every priest and shaman who's passed through here in the last 40 years. The basement felt different tonight, not just cold, but expectant, like it was holding its breath. I'd helped Clara arrange the photographs along one wall, black and white images taken during previous harvest moons that showed things I wished I could unsee. In some, the dining room appeared to be underwater, with shapes swimming through the air like predatory fish. In others, the walls themselves seemed to writhe and pulse, as if the building had become some massive, living organ. "Rule number 7, Clara said, handing me a Polaroid camera that looked older than both of us combined. "During the harvest moon, we stay below ground. Rule number 8, we trust what the photographs show us, not what our eyes tell us." Sam Whitaker arrived first, carrying a duffel bag and wearing the expression of a man who'd seen too many harvest moons. Lena followed 20 minutes later with her nephew Danny, a quiet kid in his 20s who kept glancing at the covered mirrors like he expected something to push through the sheets. "How many holes did you find today?" Clara asked Sam as we gathered around the small table she'd set up in the basement. 12, Sam said, accepting a cup of coffee with hands that shook slightly. All leading toward Route 17, all humming like they've got something alive down inside them. The humming. I'd started hearing it around sunset, a low vibration that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards and inside the walls simultaneously. It reminded me of the sound electrical transformers made on humid summer nights, but underneath there was something else, something that sounded almost like children singing lullabies. "The feeding tubes should start showing up in photos around 9, Clara said, loading film into the camera with practiced efficiency. "When that happens, nobody goes upstairs for any reason, no matter what you hear, no matter who calls your name." Lena nodded grimly. "My grandmother lived through the harvest moon of 1962, said the collector took 6 people that year, including her own sister, found their clothes folded neat as you please on their kitchen tables, but the people themselves were just gone." At 8:45, I took the first photograph of the dining room above us, climbing halfway up the basement stairs and aiming the camera toward the empty space. The flash illuminated tables and chairs that looked normal enough, but when the Polaroid developed, I nearly dropped it. Thin, translucent tubes hung from the ceiling like the tentacles of some massive jellyfish, each one ending in what looked like a suction cup designed to fit over a human face. The tubes pulsed with a sickly green light, and I could see shapes moving inside them, dark silhouettes that might have been partially digested people floating in whatever fluid the tubes contained. "Feeding tubes," Clara confirmed, studying the photograph with the detached interest of a scientist examining specimens. "The collector uses them to drain memories and life force. Once they attach, you've got maybe 30 seconds before you're gone forever." The humming grew louder as the night deepened, joined by scratching sounds that seemed to come from every direction at once. Something was moving around the tavern above us, something large enough to make the floorboards creak with each step. The scratching grew more insistent, concentrated now around the basement door like claws dragging across wood. At 10:15, we heard the first voice. "Clara?" The call drifted down from upstairs, muffled but clearly audible. "Clara, are you down there? I need help." It was Lucas, Clara's son, dead 18 years, calling for his mother with the same voice she must have heard calling from his bedroom when he was young and frightened of the dark. Clara's face went white, but she gripped the table edge and didn't move. "It's not him," she whispered. "It's never them." The scratching at the door intensified, joined now by a sound like something being dragged across the floor above us. More voices began calling. Danny's grandfather, asking him to come fix the porch light. Lena's sister, wondering why she was hiding in the basement instead of helping with dinner preparations. Then I heard Sophie. "Daddy?" Her voice was small and frightened, exactly as it had been the night she'd had nightmares about monsters under her bed. "Daddy, I'm hurt. I need you to come help me." My heart hammered against my ribs like a caged bird trying to escape. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run upstairs, to find my daughter and protect her from whatever had hurt her. I was halfway to my feet before Clara's iron grip on my wrist stopped me. "It's not her," Clara said firmly. "Sophie's in Portland with your ex-wife, safe in her bed. This is how the collector works. It uses the voices of people we love to lure us into the open." "Daddy, please!" Sophie's voice was crying now, heartbroken and desperate. "It hurts so much. Why won't you help me?" I took another photograph, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the camera steady. When the image developed, it showed the dining room filled with writhing shadows, and standing in the center was a tall figure in a black coat. The collector had no face, just smooth skin where features should have been, like someone had erased a person's identity with an industrial sander. Beside the collector stood a perfect replica of Sophie, down to the small scar on her chin and the way she twisted her hair when she was nervous. But the photograph revealed what my eyes couldn't see. The thing wearing my daughter's shape was connected to the collector by one of those feeding tubes, its false life sustained by whatever dark energy flowed between them. "Daddy!" Sophie's voice was screaming now, desperate and terrified. "It's taking me away! Please, Daddy, please help me!" I broke free from Clara's grip and ran for the basement stairs, every rational thought overwhelmed by the need to save my daughter. Behind me, I heard Clara shout something about Rule 9, but her words were lost in the roar of blood in my ears. The basement door stood open, though I was certain we'd locked it. Beyond lay the dining room, seemingly normal except for the unnatural silence that pressed against my eardrums like cotton. The feeding tubes weren't visible to my naked eyes, but I could feel them hanging in the air around me, searching for exposed skin. Sophie stood by the front window, her back to me, wearing the white dress she'd worn to her friend's birthday party last month. She looked so real, so perfectly my daughter, that for a moment I forgot everything Clara had taught me about photographs and truth. "Sophie?" I reached toward her and she turned. Her face was exactly right. My daughter's face, down to the constellation of freckles across her nose. But her eyes were black as midnight, and when she smiled, I saw teeth that were too sharp, too many, arranged in rows like a shark's. "Hello, Daddy," she said in Sophie's voice. "I've been waiting for you." That's when I remembered the camera in my hand. I raised it and fired the flash, the sudden light revealing the truth. Not Sophie, but the collector wearing her shape like an ill-fitting mask. In the photograph, I could see its real form, tall and angular and hungry, with feeding tubes extending from its body like the arms of some mechanical octopus. "You can't have her," I said, though my voice came out as barely more than a whisper. The thing that looked like Sophie tilted its head. "But I already do. Every time you close your eyes, every time you remember her laugh, every time you feel guilty for not being there when she needed you, those memories belong to me now." Clara appeared beside me, moving with surprising stealth for a woman her age. She was carrying something in her hands, a small wooden box that hummed with its own strange energy. "Rule number 9, Eli," she said urgently. "Offer a memory trade. Give it something precious, something it wants more than Sophie's voice." I understood then. The collector fed on memory and emotion, on the guilt and love and regret that defined us as human beings. It had used Sophie's voice because my love for her was the strongest emotion I carried, the one that would guarantee I'd break the rules and venture into its reach. "I'll trade," I said, facing the thing that wore my daughter's face. "Take my memory of the first day I worked here. Take the memory of how I felt when Clara offered me the job, when I thought I might finally have found a place where I belonged." The collector considered this, its head tilting further until it was nearly upside down. "Your guilt about your daughter is sweeter," it said in Sophie's voice. "Your regret feeds me better than hope ever could." "Then take both," I said. "Take the hope and the guilt. Take the memory of my first day here and the memory of the last time I saw Sophie smile. But you leave the people in this town alone." The cold hit me like a physical blow, tearing through my mind with claws made of ice and desperation. I felt the memories being pulled from my brain like pages torn from a book. The nervous excitement of driving to Black Hollow for the first time, the way Clara's eyes had softened when she'd said I reminded her of Lucas, the strange sense of belonging I'd felt when she'd handed me the list of rules. But more than that, it took the last good memory I had of Sophie, the way she'd laughed when I'd picked her up and spun her around in the backyard, the trust in her eyes when she'd asked if I'd always be her daddy, the warmth of her small hand in mine as we'd walked to the ice cream truck. The collector fed on those memories like a starving man at a feast, growing more solid and real with each emotion it consumed. But as it fed, its hold on Sophie's image began to weaken, the false face flickering like a television with bad reception. "It's enough," Clara said firmly. "You've taken what was offered. Now, go." The thing that had pretended to be Sophie looked at me one last time, and for a moment I saw something almost like pity in those black eyes. Then it was gone, taking its feeding tubes and its terrible hunger with it, leaving behind only the empty dining room and the taste of copper in my mouth. Dawn broke gray and cold through the tavern's windows, painting everything in shades of exhaustion and loss. I sat at the counter while Clara made coffee, trying to remember how I'd ended up in Black Hollow. The memories were there. The divorce, the job loss, the desperate drive north. But they felt distant, like scenes from a movie I'd watched years ago. "The first day is always the hardest to lose," Clara said, setting a mug in front of me. "But you'll make new memories. Better ones, maybe." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed her. Outside, Sam was checking his pasture for new holes while Lena distributed salt to the neighbors who'd hidden in their basements. Danny sat in his truck, staring at nothing, probably trying to remember why he'd driven out here in the first place. The collector was gone, at least until the next harvest moon. The feeding tubes had vanished with the dawn, and the humming from beneath the ground had faded to nothing. But I knew it would be back, drawn by the same ancient forces that had turned this corner of Maine into a crossroads between worlds. I'd lost something precious in the trade, not just memories, but the emotional weight that had made those memories matter. The guilt that had driven me north was gone, but so was the love that had made the guilt worth carrying. Clara showed me photographs from that first night, proof that I'd been here, that I'd learned the rules and faced the Shadow Rider and somehow earned my place at the Black Hollow Tavern. But the photos were just images of a stranger who happened to look like me, performing actions I couldn't remember for reasons I no longer understood. "You'll stay?" Clara asked as we finished cleaning up the basement. I looked around the tavern, at the covered mirrors and salt-lined windowsills, at the jukebox that played songs for the dead, and the coffee pot that never quite got clean. I'd lost the memories that had brought me here, but I'd gained something else. The knowledge that some battles were worth fighting, even if you couldn't remember why you'd started fighting them in the first place. "Yeah," I said. "I'll stay." The harvest moon set behind the pines, taking its hungry shadows with it, and I began the long work of learning who I was in a world where some memories were too dangerous to keep. The 9th week arrived like waking from a dream I couldn't quite remember, pieces of my life scattered like leaves after a storm. I stood in the tavern's kitchen at dawn, watching steam rise from the coffee pot, trying to piece together how I'd learned to make Clara's industrial strength brew. My hands moved with practiced efficiency, measuring grounds, checking the water temperature, adjusting the timer, but the knowledge felt borrowed, like I was wearing someone else's memories. The basement still smelled of damp stone and fear, but when I tried to remember why we'd hidden down there, I found only fragments: the taste of copper, the sound of children humming, and a cold that had torn through my mind like claws. Clara found me staring at my reflection in the stainless steel coffee pot, trying to recognize the face looking back. The man in the metal surface had the same brown eyes, the same stubble that needed shaving, but there was something different about him. A weight behind his eyes that hadn't been there before, or maybe had always been there, and I was just now learning to see it. "Memory gaps are the hardest part," Clara said, settling onto her usual stool at the counter. Her frost-gray hair was pulled back in its customary bun, but she looked older than I remembered, like the harvest moon had aged her in ways that went deeper than wrinkles. "You remember the emotions, but not the events. You know something precious was lost, but you can't quite name what it was." I poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs, the liquid black as motor oil and twice as necessary. The jukebox in the corner wheezed to life without anyone feeding it quarters, playing an Acadian folk song that sounded like grief set to melody. How long before it stops feeling like I'm living someone else's life? Could be weeks, could be years, could be never. Clara wrapped her hands around her mug, using it to warm fingers that never seemed to get warm anymore. "The collector takes memories, but it leaves echoes. You'll catch glimpses sometimes, a smell, a sound, a feeling that makes you almost remember. Those echoes are what keep you human." The morning routine felt both familiar and foreign, like performing a dance I'd learned in another lifetime. I knew exactly how Clara liked the coffee made, knew which tables the truckers preferred, knew that Sam Whitaker would be by around 10 for his usual black coffee and weather predictions. But the knowledge sat in my head like borrowed clothes, never quite fitting right. That afternoon, Clara showed me the photographs that proved I'd been here before the memory trade. She led me to a room I'd never seen, but somehow remembered, behind the kitchen and up a narrow staircase that creaked like old bones with every step. The room was small and windowless, lit by a single bare bulb that cast harsh shadows across the walls. Photo albums lined wooden shelves, each one labeled with dates going back decades. 1984 to 1987, 1988 to 1991, October harvest moons, the lost ones. Clara pulled down an album marked New Employees and flipped through pages of Polaroid photographs until she found what she was looking for. There I was, standing behind the counter with a nervous smile, wearing the same work shirt I had on now. The timestamp read Week 1 in Clara's careful handwriting, but I felt no recognition, only the hollow ache of something that should have been meaningful. "You adapted faster than most," she said, pointing to a series of photos that showed me learning the routine, wiping down tables, operating the ancient cash register, serving coffee to truckers whose faces I recognized but couldn't place. Most folks take months to accept what they're seeing. You did it in days. In one photograph, I was standing on the porch beside Clara, both of us facing a brilliant light that illuminated the gravel parking lot. I couldn't remember the moment, but I could feel the echo of it. Heat like a furnace, the weight of something ancient and hungry examining me, and underneath it all, a strange sense of acceptance. "The Shadow Rider," Clara said, though she didn't need to explain. Even without the memory, I knew what I was looking at. The rules lived in my pocket, worn soft as tissue paper from handling, and rule number 1 was burned into my mind. Always acknowledge the rider's headlight. Never hide. First night you encountered him, you stood your ground. Most people run. Why didn't I run? Clara studied my face with those eyes that caught everything. Because you reminded me of Lucas. And because some people are born to stand watch, even when they don't know what they're watching for. The next morning brought visitors I wasn't expecting and didn't want, though part of me felt like I should have been. 2 federal marshals arrived in a black sedan that looked like it had driven straight out of a government handbook, all sharp edges and tinted windows. They wore identical dark suits and expressions that suggested they'd seen things that didn't make it into official reports. The older one, a woman in her 40s with steel gray hair and eyes like flint, introduced herself as Agent Laura Hayes. Her partner, Agent David Chen, was younger and quieter, but I caught him studying the covered mirrors with the kind of interest that meant he knew more than he was letting on. "We're investigating a series of disappearances in the area," Agent Hayes said, settling into a corner booth with the careful precision of someone who always kept her back to the wall. 7 people in the last 6 months, all tourists or travelers passing through on Route 17. Clara poured coffee without being asked, her movements steady, despite the tension that had filled the room like smoke from a fire that burned too cold. The coffee pot gurgled and hissed, and I found myself watching the agents' faces for any reaction to the sound. They showed nothing, but Chen's eyes flicked toward the jukebox when it started playing La Llorona without prompting. "Folks get lost in these woods all the time," Clara said, setting down their cups with the same care she used for everything else. "Easy to take a wrong turn, end up on a logging road that doesn't go anywhere. These people didn't get lost in the woods," Agent Chen said, accepting his coffee with a nod. His voice carried the flat precision of someone who'd given this speech before. Their cars were found abandoned on the highway, engines still running, doors open, personal belongings intact, no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. They just vanished. I felt something cold crawl up my spine, like ice water in my veins. The sensation was familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd felt it before. "Any of them stop here?" Agent Hayes pulled out a tablet and swiped through a series of photographs. Driver's license photos mostly, the kind that never quite capture what a person really looks like. When she reached the fourth photo, I felt recognition hit me like a physical blow, though the memory came wrapped in fog. Sarah Cole, 28, from Connecticut, traveling north to visit friends in New Brunswick. Blonde hair, blue eyes, and a smile that suggested she found the world generally amusing. She'd stopped by the tavern, ordered coffee and pie, and paid with a $20 bill that smelled faintly of lavender perfume. The details came back in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle scattered across a table. "She was here," I said, though the memory felt distant, like something I'd seen in a movie rather than lived through. "Late evening, maybe 3 weeks ago, friendly, asked about the best route to the Canadian border." "What did you tell her?" "Stay on Route 17. Don't take any shortcuts through the forest." I met Agent Hayes' eyes and saw something there that made my stomach clench. "Why? What happened to her?" Agent Chen leaned forward, his pen poised over a notepad that looked government issue. "Her car was found at 2:30 a.m., parked at the overlook 5 miles east of here. Engine running, driver's door open, her purse still on the passenger seat. But here's the interesting part. Her GPS showed she'd been driving in circles for 3 hours, covering the same stretch of road over and over again." Clara's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. I watched her face go pale, saw her eyes dart toward the covered mirrors, and felt the weight of something terrible settling into my chest like a stone. "Which stretch?" "The mile between here and Pine Ridge Cemetery." "Rule number 10, Clara said quietly, so quietly that the federal agents had to lean forward to hear her. "Some who enter shadow paths never return." Agent Hayes' pen stopped moving across her notepad. "Shadow paths?" Clara stood and walked to the window, staring out at Route 17, where fog was already beginning to gather between the pine trees despite the afternoon sun. The fog moved wrong, too thick for the weather, curling around the tree trunks like fingers searching for something lost. "This ground's old," she said, her voice carrying the weight of stories passed down through generations. "Older than the settlement, older than the Algonquin hunting trails, older than anything white folks ever put a name to. There are paths through these woods that don't show up on any map, roads that only exist when the conditions are right." "What kind of conditions?" "Fog thick enough to hide the horizon, a moon dark enough to swallow shadows, and people desperate enough or lost enough to see what isn't supposed to be there." Clara turned back to the agents, and I saw something in her expression that made me understand why she'd run this place alone for 40 years. Your missing people didn't disappear. They found something they were looking for, even if they didn't know they were looking for it. That evening, after the federal agents had left with more questions than answers, Clara showed me the ledger that held 40 years of secrets. We were in the basement again, surrounded by mason jars and herb bundles and photographs that showed too much truth for comfort. Clara pulled a leather-bound book from a shelf I hadn't noticed before, its pages yellow with age and filled with careful handwriting that spanned decades. The basement felt different at night, not just cold but watchful, like the stone walls themselves were keeping secrets. "Every tavern keeper keeps one," she said, opening to the first page. "Records of who comes through, who stays, and who doesn't make it to wherever they were going." The entries were brief but precise, written in the same careful script that had recorded the rules. October 15th, 1987. Thomas Brennan, age 34, traveling to Bangor. Last seen 11:45 p.m. Car found on Shadow Path, Route 17, mile marker 23. March 3rd, 1993. Jennifer Walsh, age 29, moving to Halifax. Shadow Path opened during spring fog, never reached destination. Page after page of names, dates, and circumstances. Some entries had notes in the margins. Heard crying from the pines 3 nights running, or jukebox played The Water is Wide 17 times in one evening, or simply collector's year. Each entry was someone's child, someone's parent, someone whose absence left a hole in the world. "How many?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. 43 since I've been keeping records. Could be more before that. My grandmother wasn't much for writing things down. Clara flipped to a section near the back, pages that were newer but still filled with that same careful handwriting. The shadow paths aren't random. They open when someone needs them to, when the weight of what they're carrying gets too heavy to bear alone. I thought about Sarah Cole driving in circles on Route 17, her GPS showing the same mile of road over and over again. What were they carrying? Same things we all carry: guilt, grief, regret, love that's got nowhere to go. Clara closed the ledger and held it against her chest like it was something precious and terrible. The shadow paths promise to take those burdens away, and they do, along with everything else. The 10th week brought Amelia Moreau, and with her, glimpses of a life I'd lost to necessity. She arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt like stepping into someone else's story, though the story felt familiar in ways I couldn't explain. Maybe 25, with dark hair that caught the light and green eyes that reminded me of Clara's, but softer, less weathered by years of keeping terrible secrets. She wore scrubs under a fleece jacket and carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that looked like they'd been picked from the roadside with careful attention to beauty. "You must be Eli," she said, settling onto a stool at the counter with the easy familiarity of someone who'd grown up in this place. "Grandmère's told me about you." I poured coffee and watched her face, looking for some flicker of recognition, some clue that we'd met before. There was something there, a warmth in her eyes when she looked at me, a sadness that suggested loss, but the memory was gone, traded away for someone else's safety. "Amelia's a nurse at Eastern Maine Medical," Clara said, settling beside her granddaughter with the satisfied expression of someone watching puzzle pieces fall into place. "She comes by when she can, helps me keep track of things." "What kind of things?" Amelia smiled, but it was the kind of smile that held secrets and sorrow in equal measure. "Missing persons reports, mostly. Cross-reference them with Grandmère's ledger, see if there are patterns. Sometimes I can help families get closure, even if I can't tell them the whole truth." She spread the wildflowers on the counter, late-season asters and goldenrod, a few sprigs of pine, some red maple leaves that still held their color. The arrangement was beautiful and deliberate, like a memorial for something that couldn't be named. "These are for Amos Reed's crash site," she said, her voice carrying the kind of reverence usually reserved for churches. "I visit every month, leave flowers and say a prayer. It helps keep him settled." The name hit me like an echo from a dream I couldn't quite remember. Amos Reed, the Shadow Rider. 1987 motorcycle crash. But when I tried to dig deeper, to remember the details, I found only fragments. A headlight too bright for the fog, heat like standing near a furnace, and the sound of Clara's voice saying words I couldn't quite recall. "We used to walk together," Amelia said, studying my face with the careful attention of someone looking for a lost memory. "Down to the Penobscot River, along the old logging trails. You told me about Sophie, about how much you missed her. I told you about nursing school, about wanting to help people but not knowing how to help the ones who were already gone. I wanted to remember, wanted to feel the warmth of those walks, the comfort of sharing burdens with someone who understood the weight of watching over secrets. But the collector had taken those memories along with the others, leaving only empty spaces where something precious used to be. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it more than any apology I'd ever offered. "I wish I could remember." Amelia reached across the counter and touched my hand, her fingers warm against my skin. Memory isn't the only way to know someone. Some connections go deeper than that. That night, alone in the mirror room while Clara slept, I sat watching reflections of worlds I was only beginning to understand. The mirrors showed what they always showed. Route 17 in different states of reality, some showing the road as it was, others revealing the shadow paths that existed between heartbeats. In one mirror, the Shadow Rider's headlight cut through the fog, making his eternal rounds. In another, Sarah Cole sat in a corner booth that existed only in the spaces between worlds, occasionally looking up as if she heard someone calling her name. The jukebox downstairs began playing that strange underwater song again, and in its melody I heard something that might have been voices, might have been wind through the pines, might have been the sound of people letting go of things they'd carried too long. I was the guardian now, keeper of the mirrors, watcher of the shadow paths, the one who helped the lost find their way to whatever came next. I'd lost the memories that brought me here, but I'd gained something else: purpose, belonging, and the knowledge that some battles were worth fighting, even when you couldn't remember why you started fighting them. The harvest moon would come again next year, and the collector would return with its feeding tubes and terrible hunger. The Shadow Rider would continue his rounds, and the shadow paths would open for those who needed them most, and I would be here, watching and waiting, keeping the balance between worlds that most people never knew existed. Outside, fog pressed against the windows like something alive, and in the distance, I could hear the faint rumble of a motorcycle engine that shouldn't exist, but it was a good sound, a familiar sound, the sound of someone doing what they were born to do. I stood watch, guarding mysteries no one else could see, and for the first time since the memory trade, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged.